Hello, hello. Thank you for joining me on Grieving Voices with my guest today, Becky Ellis. She is a Timberwolf pup, the daughter of a highly decorated World War II combat sergeant. She is a veteran of a war fought at home. She earned a bachelor's in English literature at UC Berkeley and has over 20 years of experience in the publishing industry. She teaches writing in Portland, Oregon, where she lives, plays, and has raised three daughters. Little Avalanches is her debut memoir and recently won the Rubery Book Award for nonfiction. Thank you so much for being my guest today. And to be honest, I had to look up Timberwolf Pup.
Mm.
I had no idea what that was. And just reading through your website, there was one line that really jumped out at me and really resonated with me. And that's really where I want to start today, because I think it's could be a billboard. It could be a billboard quote. Um, but you say on your website, we are profoundly shaped by the secrets we keep and forever changed by the stories we share. Oof. I mean, that says it all, really. It says a lot
Mm.
about grief. It says a lot about trauma. It says, I mean, there's a lot packed into those, what is it? 17 words?
17 words. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me here, Victoria. I really appreciate being here. And that is that is the message that inspired me to even write a book to talk about the things I write about, because I learned later in my father's life all the secrets that he was keeping and realized how much they'd shaped our family. And once he started sharing his story, it profoundly changed everything about my process, my healing process, my grieving process, who I am, who I'm becoming, and it had a profound impact on me. So
Let's
I
put a pin in
hope,
that. Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah, yeah. No, go
let's
ahead.
let's put a pin in that because I want to rewind the clock because you've been in publishing for many years. What were you writing about before this memoir came out?
I wasn't writing before this memoir.
Oh,
I worked for a publisher that specialized in cookbooks and gardening books. And I worked for Time and Co Entertainment, which the brands there are Sunset and Southern Living and Cooking Light. And I did sales and marketing for those brands. And I'd also worked for a book distributor as a book buyer and a couple of different things in publishing. I love books. And after I graduated from college, I wanted to work with books. I always thought I wanted to write, but I didn't know what to write about. And I found something that I needed to write about. So I started learning to write and becoming a writer. I've written some essays and a couple of pieces of short fiction, but for the most part, the memoir is my largest body of work.
how many years did it take you to write it? Or months?
Well, I sort of start the clock when my father started telling me his story. And from that point until it was published a few months ago was a 10-year process. So I wasn't writing that entire time, but I would say 10 years from beginning to end. Yeah.
So it's do you look back now and do you find it interesting, curious, fascinating, maybe all of those things that you didn't know what to write about and yet now that you know what your body of work has created, what you've created in Little Avalanches, like what is that introspection? What did you believe? And what story were you telling yourself that you didn't have anything to write about and yet you had lived this life in the shadow of your father's PTSD as we'll get to?
So, one of the things that I learned in the process of writing and processing my childhood and processing our family dynamic and family system and all of that is that I always felt like my story was irrelevant compared to my father's. And although I didn't have any understanding of what he went through as a combat sergeant in World War II, because he wouldn't talk about it. When I was young, he would fire out, he was an alcoholic, and he would fire out bits and pieces of really scary story when he was drunk, and he would quickly stop himself. And I kind of describe that as machine gun fire stories. They were piercing, they hurt, they were horrible. And I don't think he wanted to share them, but they came out sometimes, and then he'd stop himself. And I always felt that he was such a decorated war hero, even though he never talked about that either. It's just something that we knew. And I felt the weight of the wound that he carried always. And I felt insignificant compared to that. I felt like I could never have a story as important as his story. So I didn't even consider my story. In fact, it was one of the greatest challenges in writing a memoir, was that my story and my voice needed to be more important as important as his. And my writing mentor at one time said to me, "Where are you in this story? Where are you on the page?" And I laid out all the pages of the book on my living room floor, and I put a letter on which page my father owned and which page I owned. And it was true. He owned 75% of the story. And that was a huge shift in my process of all of it, was just owning my own story and feeling my own story. And what I ended up with is understanding that children's voices are not very often heard. Children are supposed to act okay, especially when things are not okay. And it's really hard to allow children to speak. It's really hard for children to speak because we're very adaptive. We know when it's safe and when it isn't. And it's taboo for children to speak. And so I often get not a little bit, I often get super scared when I start sharing my story, because it still feels taboo for children to speak. But I think to give children a voice in the narrative of even war trauma or any kind of trauma is really important, because they aren't often heard and they don't have voices, and we don't really consider what they're thinking and feeling, because adults are sort of, I know adults really care. I care so deeply. I have three children, three girls of my own, and I care very deeply about what they're experiencing in a moment of trauma, but it's really hard to manage. So I think we care and we try, but to actually give them space to voice, I think is rare. So that was something that I really wanted to do, was make space and give voice. And it was a huge growth process for me to sort of own my own voice. So my story starts with me as a 5-year-old, and the whole first part of my book is from the voice of a child.
What do you tell your 5-year-old self now? Your child, your inner child now? Like
Mm.
what like before you wrote this book, or before this book was coming out and pouring out of you, the you before and the you now, what is the difference in how you show up in the world, but also how you show yourself that care and compassion within that you didn't maybe receive as a child?
Right. I'll start with the dialogue I have with my 5-year-old self, and I still have it a lot, which is I listen to her now. I don't tell her anything except I'm listening, and I listen to what she has to say. And when I was a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old, I used to talk to my future self and say, "We're never going to let this happen again. And we're getting out of here, and we're going to move to another continent, like we're not doing this anymore." And I listened to that, and I listened to the promises that she made to us. And I value that. And I think that's what I do, is I pull her into my lap and I say, "Okay, what do you have to say to me now? Like, where are we?" So I think I have that's a different relationship that I have with her now. And as far as how I am in the world, I think the process that I went through with um, hearing my father's story and sharing mine with him allowed me to find a much deeper place of compassion and empathy for who he is and who I am. I what he ended up doing, and it took several years, but he told me a lot of his combat trauma, a lot of his combat story, and after not talking about it for 70 years, like he refused to speak about it. He wouldn't talk about anything about the past, not 50 years ago, not 5 years ago, not 5 minutes ago. He was a man that moved forward and did nothing else but, nope, we're going forward. We're not processing the past. We're not talking about it. We're on the move. And that was how he survived the war. And that's how we were surviving life. And so when we slowed down and we had these conversations, he got to a point in his story that was so unimaginable to me and so horrible that for the first time, I saw him for who he was, not who I wanted him to be as a father or a grandparent or who I needed him to be as a child, but for who he really was. And in that moment, I was flooded with compassion for him. And I think it's really rare that we see our parents or our partners or even our children for who they are and not who we want them to be or who we need them to be. And so dropping my expectations and desires for him gave me I think empathy was not a feeling I really had for him before, to be honest, because he was tough. And I was just flooded with empathy. And I began to see the connections from his experience to my experience and how my childhood was shaped. And I now try to see other people for their reasons and their own experience. Apart from my experience, people have their own experience and it's different from ours. And so I think it has changed me in that way, is really hearing people's deeper stories. I think we can see them for who they are apart from ourselves.
Do you have siblings?
I do. Yeah. My father had 8 children. He had four
Oh,
wives and 8 children. So I have one whole brother, my brother Martin, who's a year older than I am. And I have a younger sister, Shayna, who comes from my father's wife after my mother. And the three of us are very close because we were kind of raised together. Then I have two brothers that came with his fourth wife. And I have and I know them well and I'm close with them. And I have three siblings, half siblings from his first marriage who he abandoned those children. So I don't know them well.
so were your parents, did they end up divorcing?
Yes. They were
Okay.
married about
Is your mom still living?
she is we celebrated her 94th birthday last week.
Wow.
You know,
And your
yeah.
father?
My father passed away 3 years ago at the age of 96.
Wow,
Yeah.
96. Isn't it amazing? Like, I feel like it's amazing that despite so much grief and trauma, that he lived to 96. And
Yeah.
I imagine your mother too, like she was living in the same household, like she was going through that same experience, similar experience, not same. Of course, it's going to be different for her being the spouse. Um, but so after they divorced, did you continue to live with your mother then, or did you live with your father? Or
Yeah, there was a huge custody battle for my brother and I between my parents because my father had abandoned his first three children. He drove away and just never saw him again. And his youngest was 9 months old and his oldest was 6 years old. And
mm,
while my mother has told me my father tried to contact them several times when after he left, um, he wasn't successful. And I think he really regretted that. And so he wasn't going to make the same mistake with my brother and I. So there was a really big traumatic custody battle. And wherein, my brother and I were pulled into court, and the judge asked us who we wanted to live with, which is a horrible thing to ask a child. But we ended up, my mother had primary custody, although they had joint custody. So we technically lived with my mother. Every other weekend we went to my father's, and we spent half our summers and every other holiday with my father. So we were back and forth constantly. And my mother constantly moved around the state of California. She wasn't allowed to leave California. So we moved around. She moved around California trying to get away from him. So,
So during your visitation, was it like this environment that you just couldn't wait to get out of?
yes, it was. He married Judy, who was my stepmother. And while she was super fun, she was, I think, 19 or 20 when they met and married shortly after that. So she was pretty much a child too. And my dad was about 50 at the time,
Wow.
um, or 40, late 40s. Um, she was hippie from the 60s, your archetypal hippie. She smoked pot, she did drugs, she was fun, but she was also inappropriate. And my dad was an alcoholic. And so it was really scary and unstable and unpredictable what was going to happen when we went to my dad's. Yeah.
So I read on your website your dad became a doctor.
Yes.
So amongst kind of the chaos that was ensuing in his external life, he somehow managed to get his doctorate, PhD, MD, whatever he got.
MD. Yeah. So he came back from the war in 1945 in January, early January. Within a couple weeks, he enrolled in college. Went to Case Western Reserve University. He got his bachelor's in 2 years, and he got his MD in 4 years after that. So within 6 years, he got his bachelor's, became an MD, married, and had 3 children. He married a couple months after he got home. He married his high school sweetheart and began having children right away. That's what he did. And he talked to me a lot about how he became an alcoholic because the nightmares were so horrible. He could not sleep. And so he would drink until he passed out so that he could even fall asleep because he was afraid of sleep. And that was his method of getting to sleep. And he would get up the next day and do the whole thing again. He went to school, he studied, he drank, he woke up, he went to school, he studied, he drank. I'm sure he, by today's standards, or maybe any standards, wasn't an optimal father figure. Yeah, at that time.
It's almost like he had this, like we say in grief recovery, like workaholism can be a distraction and a stirb, short-term energy relief behavior for people to avoid the pain and avoid the grief and the trauma and all of that. And it sounds like that he became a professional at that. And
Yes,
outwardly, it would look like, oh, he's an overachiever. He's, successful. And, it's like these outward appearances only tell a fraction of the story, very little of the story,
exactly.
really.
Which is true for all of us in our everyday lives. We're not well known, I don't think.
Ooh, that's a true statement. That feels like a true
Yeah,
statement. So you
yeah.
mentioned the nightmares and the dreams and things like that. And I don't know for you as a child growing up as a child griever, but I remember distinctly my dreams and nightmares being like in my dreams, I was this giant. I was a giant.
Mm.
And I would imagine being able to just pick things up and move things at my will and be able, like, it was like I was bigger than life. Um, and I remember watching Liam Neeson was in a movie called A Monster Calls. I think I cried
Mm.
during that whole movie because it's about this little boy whose mom dies of cancer, and his it's like his dream comes to life, and in the dream he meets this big monster. And it was like seeing my dreams come to life on this in this movie. I think it's based on a book too, and I highly recommend it for adults who were child grievers, because I think there's a part of that story that you would probably deeply resonate with. But
Mm.
what were your dreams growing up? Do you remember?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have one that I remember super clearly that was a reoccurring dream. And I pay really close attention to my dreams now. I've been in Jungian analysis for over a decade now. So we do a lot of dream work in that, my therapist and I, because I think the dreams are a message to the conscious mind. And I read somewhere an open dream is like leaving a unopened letter from your subconscious mind, like
Ooh.
leaving a letter unopened if you don't really examine them. So um, I don't always do it, but it's a method. And from my childhood, my reoccurring dream is that I this is so personal, it's so weird, but I was in a station wagon with my siblings and there were wolves trying to get us, right, nipping at the tailgates down, and they're trying to jump in and trying to devour us, and they're nipping at the back fender, those silver fenders that old station wagons used to have. So it was always kind of trying to get away from the bad guys, which makes a whole lot of sense to me now, and it didn't make any sense to me then. But you mentioned at the introduction, you didn't know what a Timberwolf pup is. And for your listeners, a Timberwolf is sort of the call name for the 104th Infantry Division. Every division has its own sort of nickname or call name, and they were the Timberwolves. And their logo is their patch is it's green with a wolf, kind of silver wolf head with its jaws open and baring its teeth. That is their logo. And their motto is nothing in hell can stop the Timberwolves. And
Mm.
while a lot of Timberwolves were stopped because my father's infantry division, his unit had a 300% casualty rate. So he saw so much death and experienced, I'm sure, so much grief that it's unimaginable to me how a person could go through that much grief. And my father told me, I think it was their 13th day of battle. There was just a huge massacre, and he lost most of his men in this battle. And he said after that point, he stopped remembering um, men's names. He didn't want to know them anymore. He didn't want to know. He said he couldn't handle the grief, and he always stood by. Men were not friends. If we were friends, we could not have survived the grief of the war. So we needed each other. We absolutely depended on each other, but we could not form friendships because we couldn't have survived the grief.
And it's so different today in the military.
Yeah,
It's so different today, fortunately. Um,
yeah.
Now it's like no man left behind or woman left behind. And, um, but
I
that,
think they had that spirit as well, but they were in a situation where they couldn't do that. They My father has also shared with me that the training in the military is to dehumanize the soldier, and you cannot run into machine gun fire and you cannot go to war unless you're dehumanized. He said it's absolutely horrible, but it's utterly necessary. And I feel like the same spirit was there then, is don't leave anyone behind, but you also sometimes don't have a choice. I'm sure there are times now when they also don't have a choice.
well, and what happens too is what what you really leave behind is the essence of who you are.
Yeah.
You know, he left behind himself, who he was before.
Right. And your humanity. Yeah.
Mm. What was his, um, do you mind sharing one of the stories that touched you the most that he shared with you?
Mm. There are so many that are so horrific. Um,
Maybe one
and
that maybe one that gave you a glimpse into a side of him that you never saw, but that expressed maybe the humanity that
mm,
existed amongst the Timberwolves, maybe.
so what's coming to me right now is a story that 13th day that I talked to you about was the crossing of the Mark River. And my father fought in the European theater, and the chaplain came out to the men's holes the night before. My father, the Timberwolves, I'll just say a little bit of background. They were at battle for 195 consecutive days, which is more than 6 months' time. And it's longer than any other infantry division in World War II. And on the 13th day, which you can understand, these are 18 and 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, their 13th day in battle, they crossed the Mark River, which for anybody that was there could never forget it because it was so horrific. They were trying to cross a river where the Germans were on the other side, and they were going through Belgium and trying to liberate Belgium. And the Germans were occupying the other bank, and they were just, the night before the chaplain came to their holes, they pretty much slept in mud for the entire time they were on the battlefield. They didn't sleep in beds or anything like that. And the chaplain came to their holes and read them their last rites the night before this battle, because they knew they were going into pretty much a massacre. And so my father made it to the other side of the river, and all of his men were, or most of his men were taken out very, very quickly. And I kind of go into detail in the book about it, about some of the things that happened in those couple of hours that they were over there. But one of the things that struck me so deeply about this humanity that we're talking about is that um, my father said he used to swear and yell and call his men every bad name in the book to get them to move, to like shock them out of shock and to yell at him. And at one point, my father decided to abandon the mission, which he said, to hell with what the general wants. I'm getting these boys out of here. So he found a ditch, he ran into it, started running back to the river, and he kept yelling at this one guy to get up, run, run, run. And one of the men had died, and the friend of that man, their names were Jack and Jimmy. And I believe it was Jimmy that had died, and Jack threw himself over Jimmy's body, and his face was half gone and half of his body was gone, but Jack was not going to leave. And my father said I couldn't get him to budge. So they kept going. He had to get his guys out of there. And because they're under fire, this horrible fire. And so my father ended up down at the bank of the river, and he told his guys to just start swimming, even though they're still under a tremendous amount of fire. And some of the guys wouldn't get in the water because they didn't know how to swim. And so my dad got in the water, he saw a boat on the other side, got in the water, swam over to get it, brought it back. Some guy started jumping in the boat. He's like, don't get in the boat, starts yelling. I'm not going to use all the profanity that he shared with me on this podcast. Yelling at them, don't get in the boat. They held on to the boat with just their eyes out of the water and got to the other side of the river. But And then there's some things that happened on the other side of the river that were profoundly disturbing because everybody's nerves were raw. He said they were so frozen cold. There was ice in the river also, and so many men had been lost in the river. It was full of bodies and this whole thing. But they got to the other side of the river and were so frozen and exhausted they had to crawl up the riverbank. But when they were able to get back across the river 2 days later, when they were finally able to, the whole division was able to cross, they came across Jack and Jimmy. And Jack had died. And my dad said there was not a scratch on him. And he said he thinks he died of grief, that he just lay over his friend and died. And it almost brings me to tears, just the tragedy that these boys went through. So that's one small little story. When my dad told me his story, I started taking notes on a yellow piece of paper. And then after a few weeks of hearing him, I started recording him, and I have hours and hours of his recording. But what was I going to tell you about that? I can't remember. I just lost my train of thought thinking about documenting his story. It ended up, this is what I was going to say. Thank you for giving me a moment to recall his story. I wanted to get it right. And when I wrote it all out and got the timeline all straightened out, it was over 300 pages long. And I don't think that we can handle that much grief and horror. So I reduced it down to about 32 pages, sort of like a fine balsamic reduction. And so it's enough to really give an idea of what war without glory is and what really happens on the battlefield within one soldier's psyche and amongst the men, amongst the boys and men who were fighting, the dynamics of that as well. And that's what the story I just told you is probably the longest day that I go into, because I go into that story in detail. One reason is that my father earned a Silver Star for that, going over and getting the boat and coming back. But he would never talk about, it's one of the first questions I asked him when I started talking is, please tell me about your Silver Star, because he had a plaque of it on his wall that over his desk, his home office desk. He always had it framed. And he would say, he wouldn't talk about it, but he would say he didn't do anything different that day than any other soldier did every single day. It was no different than anything anyone else did. And he doesn't know why he got it, but he kept it in the memory of all of them and what they did.
Thank you for sharing and for writing his story and documenting his story, because it's those stories of that generation that so many have been lost, I think, not documented. Again, I think it's absolutely somewhat of a miracle that he lived to age 94, right? 94?
96.
96.
Yeah. Yeah.
That just
He
blows
was tough, my dad, and I talked to him a lot about survival and surviving and the things we survive. And he said to me, Becky, the human will to survive is astounding. He said, there is such a strong will to survive inside the human spirit. And I think that's what kept him alive that whole time. That and a lot of good luck,
Did he, speaking of luck, oh, go ahead.
Well, he also took really good care of himself, I would say, physically. emotionally and mentally is a whole nother story. You mentioned about him being a doctor, and he was a doctor. And back in the 50s, when he became a doctor, everyone was a GP. So he was a surgeon and an OB, and he was all the things. And my mom says he was one of the best diagnosticians that she ever met. She was a nurse for her whole career. And I think that he read constantly in the medical journals, and he was always up on different things. And when he developed prostate cancer, he was a man with such a strong willpower. He completely changed his diet, and he had no problem doing things like that. And when I was 13, he stopped drinking. And one day he just stopped, and that was the end of it. And he never drank again after that. He had one small relapse. His wife at the time, actually, I give her a lot of credit because she said, "This is it. I'm leaving if you don't stop drinking." And so he stopped. And he had one tiny relapse, I don't know, within that year, but then that was the end of it. For the next, 50 years, he never drank again. So he had a very strong willpower as well.
So even though he stopped drinking, that didn't change. Like that anger, was there, what was it that was still being expressed from him? That, like, how did he show up then in his life after he stopped drinking?
Well, he felt much more safe to me after he stopped drinking, but he was still combating PTSD. The war never left my father. He left the war, but it never left him. And he was still unpredictable. He was he still put us in dangerous situations. And when I asked him, when he was 89 is when he started talking to me. He came to my home in Portland, Oregon, where I live, and he asked me if we had any issues to clear up. And I know. I think he thought that I was going to say, "We're fine. Look around. I have a beautiful home. I have great kids. I go on great vacation. Look around. Everything's wonderful." But I thought, this is my chance. I want to know about the war. I want to know about all this trauma we've been through. And so that's when he started talking to me about it. So he was still in his later years unpredictable. I didn't really know how he was going to show up sometimes. And when we started talking, we talked, for until the last year of his life. Um, and we talked, constantly about, he would say, "Oh, there's one more thing I forgot to tell you. It's really important. You need to know this, or you need to know that." And I had the opportunity during that time to talk to him about my childhood and process a lot of that with him. And one of the things that I had asked him was, "Why did you do some of the things with us? If I put your grandchildren, my daughters, in those situations, you would be furious with me." And he explained that he put himself in dangerous situations after the war to continue to prove to himself that he could survive. And he put the people he loved in those situations too, to continue to prove to himself that we would survive, because he was constantly in fear of our survival. So he would, you know, try to make us as tough as we could possibly be. He did things like had me get my teeth drilled without Novocaine as a child. Um, so I would be tough so I could handle things and stuff like that. Um, yeah, but it was to prove it was the survival mechanism, and I think his will to survive was incredibly strong.
I once read that, like, children who experience trauma and things, and probably even adults if they've experienced trauma, you can kind of get attracted to trauma or scary situations, or put yourself in those situations in order to, it's almost to, like, not relive, but hone those skills of survival, or hone those skills of yeah, I think survival. And so when you say that, that doesn't sound unusual to me, just knowing what I
Right,
know about grief and trauma.
right. I think we practice things that we think we need to know. where I wish we were practicing compassion and grieving instead. And I know we are now, and I know I am now. Um, and I'm glad I've kind of gotten over that hump of being attracted to trauma, being attracted to adventure. I mean, when I was in college, I went to UC Berkeley and was on the ski team, and I had no problem jumping off of cornices. I wouldn't do that now, and I see the risk taker in me, that I was. I was also careful, I was a very calculated risk taker. So, but
You
I
said
can see that.
you mentioned your dad started to talk to you and he kind of initiated this opening up at age 89. Was that before or after his diagnosis of prostate cancer?
It was about 10 years after.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's almost as if he had like this premonition of, well, I suppose he's 89. Like, how much time do I have left? Like, I think he just, do you think he really just wanted to unburden himself and maybe give you what he felt you needed to?
Well, I asked him what he was doing. I said, "What are you doing, Dad? Are you making the rounds? Are you trying to clear up old business?" And I reminded him, I said, "Don't forget, you promised you were going to outlive all of us." Because he would always say that, "Oh, don't worry about me. I'm going to outlive all of you." And I think my father's mortality was always with him. I don't think you can go to war and not be confronted with your mortality constantly. But I also think that he didn't really believe in his mortality because he had survived so long. And I think that finally caught up with him. I'm not sure. I don't know exactly. People ask me that a lot. And it's funny that I don't have a factual answer because that's a question I didn't ask. I didn't say why now, really. I
Mm.
kind of did. I kind of asked, but I didn't really dig into the depths of that. Why now? I think I felt so grateful that he was finally talking. I didn't want, it didn't occur to me as why now. It just felt like the right time, I think. It felt like he was ready. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to get him to start talking. He told me when I said, "I want to know about the war," he said, "All you need to know about the war is my feet were frozen for 172 days." And I said, "I'm sure there's more, Dad." And back and forth we went. And I think that these conversations are really hard to get started. And these deeper conversations of sharing our deeper selves, they're hard to get started, and they take time and they take drawing out. And we went back and forth for a couple hours at my kitchen table while we ate our tuna sandwich, and he finally started to talk. So i do think I do think patience is really required when we want to process with someone else or understand someone else more deeply. And persistence, patience and persistence.
Um, there's so many different directions I could take this. The parent that you were before these conversations versus the parent after, how do you think that shifted things for you?
It's a great question. I mentioned that I thought my dad said, uh, or I said that I thought my dad would think everything was fine, and I would say, "We don't have any issues. We're fine. Look around." I thought that I had escaped my childhood. And I realized in the process that I had been hiding from it, that I hadn't really escaped it at all, that I had carefully curated this life as an escape from it. Um, but that it was really like a bunker and I was hiding from my life. And I have a lot of regret about role modeling that for my daughters. My father raised me in his likeness. They say veteran father, warrior daughter. And I think in a lot of ways that's true. and I can be very competent and strident and capable and assertive. And knowing that about me, you wouldn't think that I didn't have a voice because I can perform as a very strong woman. But I really wasn't voicing that person you asked me about at the beginning, that 5-year-old inside me. She had no voice in my life. And while there were times when I'd go to battle in domestic issues, I didn't really have my voice. Who I was hiding from myself. And I have a lot of regret about role modeling that for my children. And after going through the process, and my process included talking with my father and writing my memoir, and there was so much grief that was processed in that time. I feel like sometimes I even grieve the person I was before that whole process started, because she could get through life sometimes more easily, not more joyfully or more um fully, but more easily than I do now sometimes, right? I mean, once we process everything, I think we're much deeper feelers and deeper thinkers and all of that. And I speak for myself, I'm living my life much more fully and not hiding from it. But it's scary, you know. I talk about living an open-hearted life, and that takes work. That takes work every single day. And it's hard and it takes courage and all of those things. So sometimes I grieve who I was before this whole process began for me. And I think my children absolutely have seen a shift, and my relationship with them has changed. And I've learned how to have the deep, messy, complicated conversations where we can understand each other and they can see me for my experience and understand me better for the parent I am. And I can see them for their experience and understand them better for the childhood they had and not the one that I had. Because I think for a while I was putting my own childhood experience on them, but they didn't have my childhood experience. They don't know what it's like to get your teeth drilled without Novocaine. You know, thank goodness they don't know. Um, so I was kind of mothering from a place of that they had experienced some of the trauma I had when they hadn't. So we're able to have those complicated conversations now, and I feel like I see them for who they are, not for how I was. That makes sense?
No, it does completely. I resonate
Yeah.
with that too.
Yeah.
You had talked about, you mentioned the word regret. And
Mm.
did your dad ever share any of like what his greatest regret was? Or I imagine he had probably many, but any that he shared outright with you?
He wasn't really a man that talked about that, to be honest. I can't I think he had so much deep regret and grief for the things that he couldn't control. And I don't think he looked at life as regrets. You know, one of the last things he said to me was, "We all did the best we could." And I think he really believed that. I believe that. I believe that we're all doing the best that we can do with the tools and the skills and the situations we've been given. And I think because he really believed that, that he wasn't really filled with too much regret.
I had a one of my recent episodes. It was episode 202 with Yvonne Caputo. Her dad was a World War II vet, and she had talked about how her dad opening up to her about his experiences in the war and things, it was the catalyst for them to really have these deeper conversations, and particularly for him, his end of life. Was that the same experience for you?
Absolutely, it was. Because I was so guarded of, toward him. I think every little girl and every woman wants their father's love so deeply. And so I felt like I had a loving relationship with my father, and I fought for that probably every day of my life. But I was so guarded against him that when we started talking, it was not we didn't go deep fast. It was, he rattled off Staff Sergeant, 1st Battalion, Company C, 415th Regiment, 104th Infantry Division, but he said it hard and fast, like he had said it 1,000 times before. And then I had to stop right there and say, wait a second, I don't even know what you just said. I don't know what that means. And so we talked about kind of the surface level stuff of how armies are divided and how many men were really in his unit. And when he told me his mortality rate, I was like, hang on, do the math for me. I don't understand how you get to 300% if you're alive and all that kind of stuff. And then we started going after a time into the deeper places. And it would be a curiosity of mine and wanting to know more about a person or experience and trying to fully understand it. But I wasn't sharing my experience at all with him. I was just taking and listening and holding space. But then after he started getting into some of the deeper things, I started dropping my guard and I started sharing my deeper self with him. And so him opening up was definitely the catalyst for me being able to share my deeper stories and my deeper questions with him. Because I was not going to, when he said, do we have any issues? I was not going to start with, yes, I have this issue, because I expected, and honestly, I received when I first would bring things up, he would say things like, "Oh, come on. You weren't neglected. You had the most fun of anybody." And this was his narrative. I'd say, "Not really. Like, let's talk about this. Like, this was my experience." And he defended against that. "Oh, you kids had the run of the house," kind of a thing. You tore around the basement and, you know, that kind of stuff. And we did get to the deeper places. I think he did have an understanding of me and my story in the end.
Did he exit this life as he wanted?
Mm. I was with my father when he passed away, and I had the privilege to be with another friend when she passed away. So I've been with two people, and I've had other friends pass away. And someone once said to me, "We die the way we live." And I believe that is the case with my father. I believe that he exited the way he lived, hanging on to the very end, fighting it all the way, fighting for his life until his last breath. I don't know if that's how he wanted it. The setup for how he passed away, which was at home, is what he definitely insisted on. It wasn't about what my father wanted, it's what my father got. What my father wanted, he got. That's the way things went. He refused to go into any kind of assisted care of any kind, and he he passed away in his home, and that is what he wanted. But as far as that deeper place of surrender, if um, I don't know if he got there because he wasn't talking in the last couple days of his life. He entered that phase of death where he stopped talking. And I hope he found some peace in that.
How has this changed how you're approaching the relationship? How has the writing experience and subsequent passing of your father changed how you approach the relationship with your mother?
Hmm. My mother's been super supportive of my writing all along. I think she's read every draft of my story or of my book, and I wanted her to be a part of it, and she's definitely a primary character in it. While she wasn't for a while, I was given advice from an editor that said, even when one parent has passed away, they are still a part of the story. And you have to make them a central figure in your story because they are a central figure in your life, even when they're gone. And so she became a significant part of my story. And I think that she is a person who is sort of a supportive person to many people. She was a nurse and she played the role of nurse in her life also, kind of that very important person, but that doesn't get a lot of credit for how strong she had to be to endure what she endured because my father really went to battle with her. And I think that having her story be read now is exposing her in ways that she didn't anticipate. And those ways are that people are seeing her now. Her family, there's so many things she never even told her family. And I think she's being seen now for what she went through. And I think she's feeling the compassion of others. She came to a book reading I did in the San Francisco area in Oakland, and a reader went up to her and said, "You are the hero of this story, and I want to thank you for that." And it was so deeply touching to me. Um, so I think she's coming around to realizing what an important person she really was in my life. I'm sure she felt like she was, but was in a really hard position, and I think she's being acknowledged for that now, and I think that's probably deeply meaningful to her. I feel like there's something that I have learned that we all wanna be seen and heard. So, I think my mother feels seen and heard now, but even more than being seen and heard, I think we wanna be felt. And the experience with my father, it's that I feel you feeling me. When we can feel someone feeling us, I think that is where the magic happens. And that is where healing truly happens. It's not just being seen and heard. That's one thing, but being felt is something completely different. And I think my mother feels felt now. I think her experience feels felt by others to her. And I think that is healing.
It's that well of compassion and empathy that pours out.
Mhm.
Did she ever go on to find love again?
She did. She's been married for, I don't know, over 40 years now.
That's
Yeah,
wonderful.
yeah. She didn't marry someone that much unlike my father, however,
Oh, interesting.
but she's married. Yes,
Maybe another book.
maybe.
Different kind of book. Um,
Yes.
so out of all of this experience, and I mean, we didn't even get to the other grief experiences you've experienced in your life because
Mhm.
what I know about grief is it's like luggage. It stacks up and we drag it with us. Um, and if you're open to
Well,
sharing any of those other experiences, please do. But oh, go ahead.
well, there's so much, grieving is such a central part of the human experience. And we feel like it's so intimate and so unique and personal that I think we try to do it alone. And I think it's so much more healing and powerful when we can share it with others, which is why I appreciate the work that you're doing so much. And I feel like there's so much to grieve in life, I feel like, the paradox of there is no light without darkness, and there is no joy without grief. And the more grief you feel, I feel like the more joy you can also feel. And so when I say there's so much to grieve in life, it's not that, oh, life is sad and horrible and everything's darkness. There is so much light and joy in life too. And holding both of those, I think, is where I want to be. And that I think is mental health, is when you can hold both of those. But there's so much to grieve, even about the loss of my childhood. And I grew up way too fast. So many of us grow up way too fast. And the idea of grieving that, I think, is important. Like, I think grief is so important to do and feel, so that you can feel the joy on the other end of that grief. And I often grieve, like, the woman and person I could have become, if only, and then fill in the blank. If only I had a father who this or that. If only I had a supportive childhood. If only I had the opportunity for these things as a child. There are so many if onlys I could fill in. And I often grieve, like, I wonder who I could have become if I didn't have all this trauma in my childhood. That's one that I still work with, you know, because there are a lot of trauma triggers out there. And, but, those are some that I think about this in terms of grief and what, and I feel like, I feel like our culture doesn't address grief or death very well, because grief is really the death of anything, right? It's the death of the childhood, or the opportunity to be this kind of person, or whatever. And a friend of mine once taught me, she said, Becky, flowers are a death practice. And I said, oh, say more about that. She said, well, when you receive flowers, they're going to die. And what kind of person are you? Are you the kind of person that throws out the whole bouquet when a couple start wilting? Or do you take them out one by one as they die? And what do you do with them? Do you just toss the whole bunch in the trash? And I'm like, wow, like, that's kind of amazing. So now whenever I get flowers, I use it as a death practice in a beautiful way, you know? Um, I don't cry over them and spend days mourning the death of the flowers, but I acknowledge that this is the process. Death is human experience, and it's something that we're all going to get to experience at some point. And it's an opportunity, I think. I think we need these opportunities to practice.
What's interesting that you bring that up, the flowers. When I was going through when I first started my grief processing journey, I started to collect plants.
Mm.
I'm now a hoarder of plants. Why? Because plants don't die. Plants don't die. I mean, they can. I mean, if you're not going to care for and nurture them, right? But it's something to nurture and care for. And I think that can also be a practice in giving love to something that maybe you're struggling to give in other aspects of your life.
Mm.
So I think um, that's the significance of plants for me.
That's beautiful. Some of my plants die. In fact, I love to garden. And sometimes I get the plant that's not so supposed to survive in my climate, but I'm determined that I'm going to keep it alive anyway, and I don't. And so it's a reminder, though, that we need nurturing and care and the right environment to survive, right? We can't survive in all environments. We just can't. Yeah.
And we're not built to.
No.
There is going to be these environmental things that will challenge our ability to thrive, right? Just like plants.
Yeah. Yeah. There are environmental things that challenge our ability to survive. Yeah. Yeah.
You kind of alluded to it already, what grief has taught you, but is there anything else you would like to elaborate on that?
Mm, I think grief has taught me to embrace it, to embrace the depth of it, and to go to the places that it takes me and to be open to what it's going to teach me. Um, yeah, to embrace it and feel it fully. It's not something I think we move through it. I don't think we ever move beyond it. And I did say I think it's part of the human condition. And I think a lot of us try to look away from that, look away from, the darker parts of the human condition. And I think that's avoidant. And I think it blocks us from feeling some of the best parts and experiencing some of the best parts of the human condition too. My effort is to live it all fully.
On that note, what's next for you? What are you looking forward to?
Every day I look forward to the conversations I can have where we share our deeper stories. Um, and what's next is me sharing some of that with, and in an ongoing format, sharing some of that with the people in my community. Um, I'm starting a newsletter. Authors are told to do this, but I thought I don't even know what to say to people. Honestly, I know it sounds a little bit ludicrous, but sometimes I don't know what to say. I don't know what people want to know from me. I don't know what I know. And so it's the thing that readers keep asking me about is how did you have this conversation? Walk us through it because I really want to talk to my mom and the only thing she's going to talk to me about is the broken furnace. Or I really want to talk to my dad or my brother and he won't stop talking about football. And so I've been in those situations and plenty of them. And so I've done a lot of research and done a lot of exploring and discovering on how do we get to those deeper places with our neighbors and our friends and the people who we're not well known to, but we're around all the time. How do we do that? And so I've started a newsletter where I'm going to share the deep conversations that I'm having. And one of them is one I had with my mom on her 94th birthday. And those are that's what's immediately next for me. Yeah.
When you were talking about, and I'll see if I can recall my thought that I had that escaped my brain and as I was listening to you, but um, on kind of the thread of regret, um, how was I, what was I thinking on that? Is there a part of you that wishes that you could have had that conversation and maybe opened yourself sooner to, and trust me, I believe that things happen in divine timing, and but at the same time that doesn't change how we feel, right? And do you have any regret or wishing that those conversations would have happened sooner with your dad, that um yeah.
There are a few things that I'm absolutely certain about, but this is one of them. And the answer is yes, I wish I could have. I end the first part of my book, My Childhood, with when I come back. I studied abroad when I was a sophomore in college. And after my study abroad in London, I traveled through Europe. And while my father said, "Don't you step foot in Germany, it's not safe there," I, of course, went to Germany. And because I was going to do what I wanted as a 20-year-old. And when I was in Germany, I met an SS officer and talk about divine timing. And it was such a profound experience that I was with two girlfriends and he came to our table and sat down with us in a German brew house, and he wanted to talk to us. And he cried. It's almost like he was flash forwarding for me what I was going to get to do with my dad 50 or not 50, whatever, 30 years later. And he confessed he talked about his regret. He confessed his not the acts that he did, but his participation in the war. And he suggested that we go to Dachau. And so the next day, my girlfriends and I went to Dachau. And anyone who's been to a concentration camp museum will, it's a very moving experience. And when I was there, I thought, oh my God, this is why my dad wouldn't talk about it. This is what, how could he talk about this? How can anybody talk? Like, it's so horrible. It's so hard to process and feel and talk about. But when I came back, I had a determination that I was going to find out if this is why he wouldn't talk about it. And I thought, this is my opening to talk about it. Like, now I have an understanding, right? As a 20-year-old, I thought, oh, now I get it. Because my father's division did liberate Nordhausen concentration camp. So while it wasn't Dachau, it was a horrible experience for anybody that was there. And I thought, oh, this is my opening. I can talk to him now. But within seconds, so I tried. I walked in the door, I hadn't seen him in months, and this is what I wanted to do, and I had this agenda, and I thought this is what I was going to do, and I really wanted it, but he shut me down absolutely and immediately, in the way that he could shut someone down, which was, are you trying to ruin this beautiful day? And that piercing look and that steely cold. I say my father is like a glacier that I was trying to crack open with a pickaxe or a teaspoon or something, But I wish that we could have had the conversation back then. I wish I could have gone through this process back then. That's one of the things, like, I wonder who I would have been if only. I wonder how I would have spent the last 30 years. And I also believe in divine timing, like you do. And so I accept the fact that it happened when it was supposed to happen. And I appreciate that.
I've been to Dachau too.
Have you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. This has been a lovely conversation. Much of it I resonate with, and I wish I would have read your book before we chatted.
Oh.
Is there anything that you feel like you didn't get to share that you think that is on your heart, or that you feel would be beneficial to listeners?
I don't think so. I just encourage people to have the conversation, say the thing that they're not saying. I think most people have something that they're not saying, a deeper part of themselves that they're not sharing. And I think it's important that we start doing that with each other in safe places.
Yeah. It's like we can hold the fear of how the person will respond, but we can also have the courage that if they don't respond how we wish, and it's releasing the expectations, right?
Right.
Because it does take two to have a deep conversation, and it might just be that one person isn't ready. And like you said,
Right.
to accept that when it will happen is perfectly, when it will happen is perfect timing, right? Of when it will happen, and to accept that.
Right. Patience and persistence.
Patience and persistence. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where can people find you if they would like to connect with you, and where can they find your book, all those things?
I think the easiest place is probably on my website, which is beckyellis.net. And that's kind of a portal for all the social media stuff and my book can be found where at bookstores and at e-retailers, Amazon, bookshop.org, those kinds of places. Yeah.
Well, I will link to that in the show notes. And thank you again for being my guest.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I loved our conversation. I really do appreciate the work you're doing.
And thank you for writing Little Avalanches.
Mm, thank you.
And remember, when you unleash your heart, you unleash your life. Much love.